Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Hi, this is Michael Waits with ATP Stories, Asia Tech Podcast Stories. I'm with Phil Morle. Phil is a partner at Main Sequence Ventures. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good, thanks, Michael.
You sound fabulous.
Thank you.
It's a little bit of an inside joke. So we've known each other for how long now? 5, 6 years? Has it been that long?
I think so, about 5 years.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me, right? And again, we didn't talk about this off air, but I did want to mention this. Like, in my mind, I was first introduced to what you guys were doing, right, through my time at Ardent Capital. And I remember sitting in the office thinking about, like, how pioneering what you guys were doing when you started. And in the context of everything else that you've done over time, it kind of makes sense to me. You know, back then I didn't know as much as I know now, but I just look at all of the things that you were involved in and just how all of that came together. And now I guess I'd really just like to find out more about that.
Sounds good. Well, I mean, you know, I think I'm pretty excited about what you guys are doing at Ardent Capital, because I think one of the things that that's driven such a busy life for me is, you know, I'm a frontier guy. I like being at the frontier, making new things and, living in the future, which is sometimes, you know, said to me as an insult and sometimes as a compliment.
How does that end up being an insult? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, I think, the people around me that need to get stuff done sometimes look at me and go, can we just get the stuff finished that we started yesterday before we get on to the stuff that we need to do next year? I think usually it's a bit of usually it's a compliment.
Yeah, fair enough. So why don't you tell me, like, how you got started in this whole business? I mean, I tried to go back as far as I could, and I don't think I could go back far enough, actually.
Okay. Well, I suppose, most entrepreneurs, when you scratch back the topsoil, you find an unusual background. I think
sure.
Most entrepreneurs are kind of curious people driven by, trying to understand something in the world that they didn't understand before, or trying to make something new. And certainly my background is not different in that whilst I grew up in a very technical family, I mean, my dad, made, computers from the circuit board up, and my brother taught himself programming and is now a sort of very senior Facebook person. But I kind of, in those days, technology was not aligned with my mind, which is more of a creative mind, I think, than a technical one, even though I've had a rich technical life. And so unusually I decided, having failed most of my exams and, run all the clubs at school and, put on musicals and, conducted the orchestra and done all these things, I decided I would study to become a theatre director. So that was what I actually did my honours degree in, and what I then spent the next 10 years of my life doing. Incredible skills for, if you want the best training to be in startups, then try and be a theatre director for 10 years, because being a theatre director requires an ability to sell thin air to audiences. Because you frequently have to describe an incredible creation which you've only just thought about and won't become real for another year or so, which is quite like starting a startup. And you also have to build a team around you for a sustained period of time, and you need to motivate them with things other than money, because there is no money. And so that was incredible learning for me, and actually having the same ensemble of actors working across the UK and Australia for 9 years, I think it was altogether, and keeping them together and keeping them motivated by vision, and putting on big international festival performances was was where I think I learned what I needed to get done as a startup founder. And,
See, I think that the movie, film, sort of theater business is completely equivalent in many ways, actually, if you don't mind me interrupting you, to the startup business. And to put a really fine point on it, right? You look at 10 scripts. You try to make the decision as which one of those will be the best, so 9 of them don't make it. It's already starting to sound familiar.
Yeah.
Right. And no one's ever made that particular show before, so it's completely new and creative. Someone's trying to tell a story or build something that no one's built before. It still sounds familiar, right? You don't know, like, if someone just jumps into this conversation, they're not really sure what I'm trying to describe. And it goes on, like you said, you have a team which you have to motivate. You have to have them maybe distributed because some of them are in one place, another in another place. Then you have to gather them all together. And then you have to convince other people that they want to actually see this thing. I mean, it's the perfect training, I think, making a movie, making a show, whatever it is, for doing a startup. It's the same thing because in a way, every production in and of itself is a startup. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, one of my favorite stories about pitching as something we all have to do a lot is from a famous Australian book called The Songlines, and it's written by a guy called Bruce Chatwin, and it's about the Aboriginal songlines which span the country, and it's how the indigenous people here in Australia actually navigate their way from one place to the other by singing these songs about the landmarks on the journey. And if you sort of get enough people together, you end up with the kind of, the map of Australia or of the world. And in the book, there's a chapter in which they're driving along in the outback, and the Aboriginal elders in the car are all singing. They're singing about the land, and they start singing Fester and Fester. And Bruce Chatwin says, "What's happening? Like, why are you singing Fester?" And they said, "Because we want to get there quicker." And what he recognized at that time is actually it's not that they're singing about the land that they can see, but they're singing the world into existence. That because they sing, the world becomes real.
Yeah.
And I talk a lot about and think a lot about pitching being doing exactly that. It's kind of the first manifestation of your company. There's nothing to it except your story, and then eventually maybe some slides and some images. And but really, it's the first version of the company, and over time it fills out with a materiality. And in fact, when we started Main Sequence Ventures a few months ago, that one of the first things that we actually did was create the pitch or the story that we would be taking to the country. We've just done a big national tour around Australia to all the major cities, and that pitch deck we actually wrote, 4 months ago, but none of it was true. It was all just kind of, this is what we have to pitch in 4 months. This is the company that has to be real by then. And so we told the story, and then we made the story real. And I think that's a great skill that I learned in theatre, and I use to this day to great success.
Yeah, I mean, you and way more than I have, but I a little bit as well, have spent some time sort of helping companies raise money. And one of the things that I tell them is that you have to build a story. Yeah. And that story it can't be a fake story, right? It has to be true. But the truth in that story is the vision for what that company is going to be. And it's all the things that you just mentioned, right? It's creating that company out of nothing and saying, here's my idea. Here's what I think. Here's who we are. And here's why we think we can do this thing. And then here's what we're going to do. And that's exactly what you've just said. So it's just interesting and it falls right into the song lines. I love that whole concept of if we sing faster, we'll get there earlier.
Yeah, exactly. We need that skill as entrepreneurs, don't we? We just need to sing faster.
Yeah.
Everything will go back. So I mean, there was heaps of great skills that came out of that time for me that I still use. And the feedback I get is that is generally the contribution I make to the people I work with. It's it's sort of how to find that edge, that sort of special sauce that makes you stand out, and usually is in the story and it's fleshing out why people are doing what they're doing. I think it's as an investor when we're looking at things, of course, it must tell a story about how it's going to make money and how it's going to give us a return as an investor. But then they all do that. I mean, all of the literally hundreds of pitches and opportunities that come across the desk, make that, actually make that assertion. But the ones we want to invest in are the ones that have that. And through the story, you get a feeling that the founder or founders are getting out of bed in the morning, excited and committed to having an impact, and they're telling a story about what that impact is, and it's the impact that drives them. And then, as investors, we believe that if that's what's driving them, these people are going to carry on going until this is done. And that's what always excites me. Just what is that story? What's the purpose? Why we're doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I love this whole concept. I think I have to read this book now, The Songlines.
Yeah, it's a lovely read. It's also where the kind of Moleskins notebooks comes from. He's
famous for the notebooks.
He's the guy that's famous for chasing that, trying to find these rare notebooks in the world before they were kind of in every airport news agency in the world.
Pioneers sort of band together, I guess.
Yeah. So, I suppose so after I finished when I was still doing the theatre, actually, the transition had already started to occur, because one of the things that's clear about theatre is you don't make great money making great theatre. So whilst I was doing that, I was making websites for people on the side. In fact, I always say that I was kind of tricked by the tech industry to get into the tech industry, because if you think about the early days of browsers and what they did, I mean, very basic HTML was very basic. So as someone with a design capability, it was sort of reasonably easy to start using HTML to make something that's aesthetically nice, and then it gets a bit richer. You can put images in there, and then, there's this sort of really simple JavaScript code that allows you to roll over things and they kind of change their state. So your design gets a little bit more interesting. And kind of before I knew it, I was kind of, sucked into this world, buying every book I could on web programming, so that I could be a better designer. But then eventually I was making backends and the full gamut of full stack web development. And as we got to the end of the 90s, I was thinking that the train is starting to go pretty fast now. This sort of web train, this sort of digital technology train is starting to go pretty quickly, and it's getting more and more difficult to be a kind of part-time participant. Like, right. If I don't get involved, I have to be happy with the train going off into the horizon. So I decided that in fact, the decision at the time was not what actually happened. The decision was, let's invert the career now, and let's make the web and the technology work the primary activity. And then I'll have like a sabbatical once a year and make some crazy art that I love to keep my soul intact. And what was quite interesting is that I found that I think that's what I discovered, actually, what I do, because I realized that working on web experiences with a team was not different to working on theatre experiences with a team of actors. And I realized that the thing that I do, which I enjoy, is making something out of nothing and doing that with a team of people in a creative and fun way. So I found that I didn't actually miss the theatre when I moved into technology, and I just dove straight into it in the height of that .com boom, and it was during that time that I became the sort of senior web guy working for a company called Brilliant Digital, and that company got the gig to make a website for this scrappy little startup in the Netherlands called Kazaa. And
those guys were pretty scrappy across the board.
That's right. So the company had just put their beta version out. They had a few thousand users. They had just been sued by the Dutch copyright agency because they were making the kind of next generation version of Napster, which was sort of very big at the time, but they had a mission which we thought was very interesting, which was to sort of try and take that groundswell of consumer behavior that was happening in Napster, believe strongly that it was about access to music and media more than it was about freeness. And we got excited about helping the Kazaa team kind of making a kind of legitimate version, I guess, of something, a new kind of entertainment business model, driven by what was clearly a consumer demand. And so we made the website for them, and then very quickly, though, because of all the legal action and so forth, the business itself actually ended up in Australia, and I became the chief technology officer of the business. And that was a very exciting time for me because it was it was one of those sort of perfect storms of activity with what was happening in the market. So within months, Napster had been shut down by the courts in California, and all the users came over to Kazaa.
And this was a really strange time, actually, if I remember correctly, right? So Sean Fanning, I believe, was a student in Massachusetts, and he was sort of credited, I guess, along with Sean Parker, if I remember. My memory's not so great, right? For creating this peer-to-peer thing that was, trading music. If I had music on my hard disk, back then everybody had hard disks, you could borrow it from me or you could use it. And the music companies just went nuts, right? And everybody got sued. This whole file sharing peer-to-peer thing was really, it looked like a bunch of piracy. And yet in Europe, there was what was his name? Nicholas Zenstrom and his partner, Jannis Fries, right?
Yeah.
And these guys just were on a mission. It seemed like they were just going to take over the world. I remember watching what these guys were doing, and Kazaa to me is actually a really fascinating company because that was just the beginning for those guys, and clearly it was just the beginning for you too. But I just wonder, because we didn't know that Kazaa was going to end up being Skype, and I remember not being Skype, but leading into Skype because those guys were involved, I think. And I remember when Juiced came out, I downloaded all this stuff, like all of it, because I thought the future of television is this thing. Really, I want to be at the future, and I was kind of like you. And then the RDO or radio, I just remember all of this, and like the fact that it moved from the Netherlands to Australia to you, I think is amazing. Like, don't you look back on that and just think, really?
No, it was.
Do you know what I mean? Like, that's
it
amazing.
Was extraordinary, and Nicholas and Jannis are unstoppable beings.
Yep.
And
what was it about those guys? Like, where did they come from? How did they? Do you know what I mean? Like, because they just preconceived all of these things that are now we just take for granted.
I just think they're fantastic examples of the perfect entrepreneur in many ways, because they see an opportunity, and they go for it like surgically, but even doing that, they adapt and learn and figure out better ideas when things come along. I mean, Skype, for example, was, we played a part in the emergence of Skype. I've got this great photo of, me with a laptop held up to my ear, and it's got this sort of version 1 beta of Skype, which was just a console application at the time, where I was kind of calling somebody in the other room in Estonia. But it's all based on exactly the same technology that's in Kazaa in terms of how it sort of shares the database globally across the world of people that are online and how the various connections happen. But, the first version of Skype, if I remember rightly, it was called Skyper, not Skype, and it had to change to Skype because there was already another website, Skyper, and it was originally, again, if I remember rightly, going to be something more like FON, i.e., sort of bandwidth sharing, and the challenge that they had as a team was, it's not useful for bandwidth sharing if it's only on a couple of machines. Like, it only becomes useful if when you show up somewhere and you sort of turn on the app, you can find connectivity through somebody else. So you've got to have lots and lots of installations, and so they kind of thought of this instant messaging and VoIP service as a kind of a way of making it useful so that they could get the distribution. And the first bit of distribution, it in fact actually happened through Kazaa itself. So we bundled it with Kazaa. It was part of the Kazaa installation. So the first sort of 5 million or so Skype installations came from that, which of course gave critical mass to the business. And I think that this is another one of those classic stories that I think it's important for new entrepreneurs to understand, because, it's easy to look at companies like Skype and say, wow, those guys, they just made the perfect product and the world wanted it and they kind of came swarming in. Whereas, well, no, just like the rest of us, no one gave a shit about Skype at the beginning. Nobody wanted it. Everyone was perfectly fine using other things. No one was going to use a platform where you didn't know for sure the person at the other end also had it. And because Nicholas and Yanis are such good entrepreneurs, they manufactured the way to get to that first sort of tipping point where there were enough people to actually have Skype communications with. And that was a big point for Skype. It was, set it on the path it's on today. And, we just see these guys doing it time and time again, and these days largely just helping other entrepreneurs through their investments, think like they do, but they're surgical and unstoppable, and they keep going until it's working.
But again, now you brought up another really interesting point, and that is sometimes you start with one thing, move on to another thing, and then build the thing that you really had conceived from the beginning without even knowing it. That's amazing. And I think you're right. These guys were so good, because I remember file sharing to me is what that represented, and I didn't care. I understood peer-to-peer, and I'm not so musical. I love music, but even Napster, it never bothered me to have to buy a CD. Even ripping it wasn't a concern. I loved doing that, and then broadcasting it in my whole house. Like, for me, the interesting thing was just having music digitally that I could then put on speakers in my whole house. But I got the whole peer-to-peer thing. But what these guys got, I just watched and just thought, amazing. Just amazing.
Well, I mean, I suppose what they figured out is, if we go back to those times when Kazaa began, the experience of the internet was very one way. It was large media companies like AOL pushing content to us consumers, and it was just another kind of 1.0 media. But with it was actually quite thrilling in the early days of Kazaa, because remember, this is also prior to YouTube existing.
That's exactly where I was going. Yeah.
So it was overflowing with videos of people at parties and things like that. The kind of stuff you see user generated on YouTube today it was the first way of being able to share all that stuff. So it started to change behavior. But also I think they looked at the world and just went, there's kind of a whole bunch of waste here because there's all this stuff getting pushed out from single centralized sources. And what if we could kind of separate that out somehow and actually share the load across the whole internet? What if the internet, its full power was used? And that's really what Kazaa did first. That's what they then moved into Skype as a way of communicating one-to-one. That then moved into all the other things like audio and Juiced and things like that. And some of those worked and some of them didn't work. And yeah, of course, business models changed as well. I mean, during the time of the ascendance of Juiced, bandwidth from a centralized location went down in cost and capacity went up, and all the big data centers started emerging, and all the telcos started having fatter pipes between the continents. And, that we sort of entered into a period where it was just as cheap to get it centralized and perhaps more dependable. And so at the same sort of time, we saw things like the BBC iPlayer moving from peer-to-peer back to being centralized to sort of to handle that sort of thing. So Juiced sort of didn't really make it through that time of change. But, so Nicholas and Yanis stopped doing it.
Yeah, I remember when it stopped as well. But and again, there's a little bit of circular here, but I can just imagine them being in their development offices, right, working with Kazaa and saying, wait a second, if we can share bandwidth and have it distributed, then, and if we can use TCP to break everything into little packets, which means that they're one thing on one side, across the wire, they're just a jumble of noise and nonsense that nobody else understands except the technology and the software. But when it gets to the other side, we can put it back together and make it into something. I can just see them going, okay, that's a phone call.
Yeah.
But somebody else sitting in the office and going, no, that's not just a phone call. That's also television, it's radio, it's movies, and going, holy shit, we've got to build all this stuff. But that gets back to the song lines of like, we got to start singing faster in this office because if we're going to get to the future, we got to do it quickly before everybody else figures it out. But that's, and that's really interesting to me as well.
Yeah. And, I think there are other successes. They had an absolutely brilliant engineering team in Estonia. And if I understand the story about that correctly, they found those guys by literally putting an ad in the Tallinn newspaper, saying developers wanted. This is before, Tallinn now largely thanks to Skype and Kazaa is, highly regarded as a place to get software development done. And, but they had an insight about that already. And, that sort of great Soviet engineering education that happens over there was very beneficial to Kazaa and Skype.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about, because we could do an entire show on Estonia, the digital country, and how they're taking advantage of sort of not e-citizenship, but sort of e-residency and all the things. They are at the forefront of a lot of things still. And I don't think most people understand that they've been doing, this is not a new thing for them. This is something that they've been doing for decades, 2 decades now.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel, to a certain extent, I feel like, people like you must see the world in a completely different way than a layperson, because you've kind of been running full speed ahead for the past, 25 years. And most people are just trying to get in now.
Yeah. I think it's, it's almost a torture that, it's or like addiction. You get into this business.
Can't get out.
And things are happening so quickly that, we have to go fast to keep up, but it's really hard to stop going fast if I wanted to these days.
Yeah, I like to say that I'm completely unemployable by a large organization, particularly the type of large organization where I used to work and had a pretty decent career. And the reason why is not because I'm dumb or anything else. It's just because the rest of the world has separated itself from that. It's moving so fast and so much fun. I feel like I'd stop learning things if I got off this train. And like you said, you can either just make a decision, right? You can stay on the train and just run with it, or you can get off and let it go by. And I'm not going to let this go by. I cannot let it happen.
No, I'm the same. And I think it's, the other sort of question that pops into my mind at least once a year is, Phil, why don't you just do something simpler? Why don't you do one thing instead of 100 things all at the same time? But I think the answer I keep giving myself is that it is actually what I do. I'm not a one thing person. I'm a portfolio player that helps a community of people go faster and do more and be more successful. And I guess I've just become good at that over the years, and I should just surrender to that and keep doing it until my last breath, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to skip because there's so much to talk about, but I did want to talk a little bit about Pollenizer, because that, again, to me was something that was like a shining light that really was committed to, like you said, helping a community just build things faster and build things better.
Yeah, I think the Genesis story of that was when Kazaa wrapped up, when we've been sued to smithereens by the copyright industry of the planet. Mick Levinskas and I, who had worked together very, very closely in the trenches at Kazaa, said, let's go into another startup. This is great. This startup business.
This is it. This is the thing we should do. Yeah.
And we kind of looked around Sydney at the time. And we just couldn't find any startups. They were what was happening in Sydney in those days, which is, around sort of 2007 or so. It was that there was indeed some startup activity. It was usually run by high net worth individuals or people that had done a startup before. They were very quickly leaving Australia and going to Silicon Valley to sort of follow the money. And so Mick and I were in a bit of a fix because we were thinking, well, if we want to do this kind of work, how are we going to do it? Do we have to go and live overseas again, or is this something we can do here? And so we said, well, let's just get started and start helping other people, with what we learned at Kazaa. And at the time, there was a bunch of people trying to set up Y Combinator style entities here in Australia, and time after time they failed because what they said as a sort of process was: step one, raise money. Step two, create an incubator and invest in companies.
Right.
And Mick and I just said, look, we can sort of join that roadkill list of people that try and convince people to start this new thing called an incubator and give us some money, this highly risky capital, or we can just start. And so we just classically sort of bootstrapped the business. We had kind of 50% of our time working on, big consulting projects, like we worked on the iPlayer, for example, for the BBC. And then on the other hand, we helped startups, and we had sort of a business model for each. And, obviously one was less money and some sort of compensation through equity, and the other one was just good money for doing the consulting.
Right.
But what we found was that, after about a year or so, we'd got quite a good reputation, but we were really struggling with working with the two business models concurrently. So for the big consulting clients that should have been paying us good money, we were kind of going, well, we were putting in lots of extra work. So we had a sort of passionate commitment to it, like a startup, and we were doing too much work for the money, basically, that we were getting paid. And then on the startup side, sometimes we'd be saying, well, it's Wednesday now and Tuesday was our day with you, so we can't help you, which of course is no good for a startup.
Right.
You've got to be able to flex. And so we said, we've got to pick the path that we're going to go on. And so we did raise some money at that time, and it was only $500,000 from a very sort of small group of angel investors who were basically the first angel investors in Australia who had made their money from technology. So it was people like Mike Cannon-Brookes from Atlassian, and we started investing in the companies and actually supporting the work that we did through that funding rather than this kind of bootstrapped consulting work. And that was a very good move. And we, Spreets was one of the companies that we started in that process, which was our group buying platform. It went on to become the biggest group buying platform in Australia, and 12 months from inception, we sold that business to Yahoo for $40 million. And that was really the moment that Pollenizer was kind of on the map, I guess, as a real thing. We had lots of companies coming to us. We have big companies coming to us saying, what the hell just happened? You just made a company and exited a company in the time it takes us to write a business case. How do you guys work? How does this, just teach us what you do? And so that kind of began the next phase of Pollenizer, which was as we continued to incubate the businesses, how can we sort of help people become better entrepreneurs? How can we reflect outwards what we're learning and do that deliberately and at high velocity so that the whole ecosystem can learn faster? And we did that for startups, and we did that for big companies and governments, both with sort of different use cases. Well, obviously the big company and government work was, that helped to fund the Pollenizer machine, but it also gave the startups that we were working with sort of terrific access to the boardrooms and opportunities that were in some of the world's biggest companies. So everyone from Coca-Cola to Telstra to Singtel. We've worked with so many big companies over the years, and to really explain the difference explain through action as well, I should say, which is really important, the difference between how a startup operates and functions compared to how a big company functions. And that became a very big voyage of discovery and understanding for us, because the gap between how the two different types of company work is spectacular.
It's so different, right?
Yeah, but I think before we get into that, I think the really interesting thing about Pollenizer's learning was this whole idea of what is the business model around being an incubator, and we were an incubator, not an accelerator. And just my distinction of that for the listeners is an incubator is really a founder. An incubator starts work on something when it's an idea, and then they turn it into a company. They incubate it like a small baby, and then it becomes a real company. And at least in our experience, there is no exit, from working with that company. It's just an ongoing engagement, as opposed to an accelerator, which tends to be, it takes a company that already exists and then accelerates it to a sort of step change in funding or operations 3 to 6 months later. So we were definitely the incubator, and it's a very challenged business model because it's like a snowball rolling down the hill. When you start one company, that's fine. You start a second company, that's fine. You start a third company, it's getting a bit harder. But then before you know it, you've got 26, 30, you've got lots of companies, and they're all still requiring effort, and that the effort's getting harder and bigger each time. Right. And the incubator's still attached, and even if we just take a simple thing like raising money, we see this a lot with the incubators that are in Singapore and Bangkok and across Australia. Now they've got all these companies, it almost becomes a bit of a liability when you say we're a Pollenizer company or we're a JFDI company, or because investors are going, God, another one,
right.
like I've already invested in two.
Right.
I don't want to invest in more. And so it becomes quite hard to make that sustainable. We found we had to become this sort of massive sort of attractor of capital, both directly for ourselves and for the companies. And it really led me to the view that certainly at the incubator level, this whole sort of success comes from having a large scale portfolio sort of thesis that many accelerators and incubators have. I just really don't believe in that anymore, because it's I think you end up doing a disservice to the companies, and I think especially when we're founding companies, it takes such an effort that the way in my mind, the way to be a sort of high integrity, real founder of a company as an incubator is to actually behave like a founder and believe in it as much as the founders. Right. But of course, there's sort of epic heavy lifting involved with that, and it's very demanding. But that's how I roll today. I know what it feels like to be a founder, and the more I can be with them with my sleeves rolled up, the better. And I kind of have that expectation for the people around me as well. So Pollenizer, after that, we had this swell of companies. I think at our height, we started 10 companies in 1 year. Wow. And then we quickly kind of scaled that back again to, just starting maybe one a year. And that was a lot more manageable. And, I think we did a better job working with the companies.
Yeah. I mean, so I've come out of a portfolio trading background, and one of the things we talked a lot about was optimal size and portfolio optimization. And it sounds like you've learned a ton about that along the way in building a portfolio and building the right sized portfolio. And you're right, because every company you build, it just starts taking an accelerating, for lack of a better term, amount of energy and money. And it's almost impossible to do at super scale, because there just aren't enough physical resources to manage all that. From my mind, I'm not saying you've said that, I'm just saying from my perspective, right? Which means that you have to find the optimal size as well. And it's always great, you see a new idea, you have sort of the monetary resources to fund it, let's say at the beginning, and once it almost spins a little bit out of control for me, right? Because managing 5 things is not like managing 50 things, even if all 50 of them are great. But you're right, it does do a disservice, I think, at some level to some of the companies if they can't get like the full force of all of your experience and all of your intelligence behind it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think investing in later stage things, maybe there's some truth to the sort of large portfolio play and just placing bets across lots of different areas. Maybe. And it's certainly true that you just can't tell which way some things are going to go. The dogs turn into heroes and the heroes turn into dogs. But I think, my thesis throughout my career has been to invest in things that I can genuinely participate in, giving them a better chance of success. And if I say that and then I'm too busy to help, then I'm actually doing the inverse there. I've kind of come in to help, and I'm actually making it harder. I'm not giving them anything that I have. So, so I like to sort of give that time and effort.
So how does that get us to main sequence? You stopped doing Pollenizer a year ago, beginning of this year. I can't remember exactly when, but I remember feeling like, wow, it's the end of an era in a way.
Yeah. So it was, I think, I feel, I'll tell you what, it was a hard decision.
Yeah, it must have been.
Because when you sing the world into existence and over 10 years, it becomes, your life, and it becomes the story, and it's like, my email address at Pollenizer was also my sort of Netflix profile at home. Right. Like I just was Pollenizer in every respect. And, but just like we were talking about Nicholas and Yanis needing, being able just to learn from the market and change, there comes a time where, there came a time for me where I had to eat my own dog food and actually look at what was happening critically and, make a decision about whether the impact that I was wanting from the world was really going to come from Pollenizer. And I think the answer that I came to from that is that it did. I think we did, in the past tense, a brilliant job at Pollenizer. We did play a material part in the ecosystem emerging, along with a whole bunch of other people here in Australia and Southeast Asia. And wow, that was just so exciting. That's how we know each other, of course. That's working together in Bangkok, and so being a part of the Singapore ecosystem exploding, and the Philippines ecosystem exploding, and the Indonesian ecosystem exploding, and helping the Myanmar startup ecosystem get started. To have had the privilege to have met all those people doing amazing things and to learn from them and to try and share some of the things we have, that was brilliant. But then looking at it as a business model, it was on a plateau, and it had been on the same plateau for a couple of years. It was very difficult to imagine it becoming a bigger business model than it was. I described it to a few people. It's like, if it was a train, I was kind of like, I was just frantically shoveling coal into the boiler every single day, just to try and get it to the next station. And it was just kind of too hard. And the impact that it was having at that stage was kind of, it not as much as I'm happy with. I want more. I want bigger. I want epic scale. And so the metaphor I came to at the time is it was kind of like like when the Apollo 11 goes up into space and they've got those big booster rockets that sort of get things up into orbit, but then those booster rockets kind of fall back to Earth and burn away. That's kind of Pollenizer for me. It's kind of, it played a really important role. I really hope it contributed in the way that we as a team tried to contribute to the various ecosystems we participated in. But, now all those ecosystems are in orbit. They are amazing. They're active. They have their own momentum. There are many, many different highly specialized resources available. There's more money available than there's been for a while. There's a lot more talent. There's a lot more entrepreneurial capability as a discipline, and Pollenizer is, in my mind, just simply not needed anymore. And so we got to this point where we go, well, now everyone's in orbit. What do we do next? And what we've been doing in the final 12 to 24 months of Pollenizer, which we had, become very passionate about, was we'd started working in new contexts. So we'd started working in what we now call deep tech. We started working with scientists and researchers. We started working for people that are trying to innovate around how farms get more yield, how cotton growers grow more cotton,
right.
how farmers get more milk, how we started working with material scientists. We designed the CSIRO's On Accelerator program and facilitated it for a couple of years, and really learned so much from that. And that was very interesting, because at the beginning of that time, when we were kind of brought into the CSIRO and we were briefed, we were told, to really pay attention to the culture of the scientist, and acknowledge that a scientist thinks differently to an entrepreneur. And so we can't just rock in there and give all the Y Combinator spiel and take over the world and, have big ideas and expect scientists to really come around to it. We need to, be a bit softer than that. But that what we in fact discovered working with scientists was that scientists and entrepreneurs are driven by the same things. You know, you decide to be a scientist and you decide to be an entrepreneur because of a couple of things in my view. One is you're curious, and one of the big drivers about whatever it is you decide to do is that you're trying to learn something new, understand something that somebody else doesn't understand. And you want impact. You want to do something that makes the world better. And those two sort of aligning properties were what really drove our work in the ON program and with this sort of larger community of scientists becoming entrepreneurs. And it became very exciting because I think I felt like I've been in something of a you know, a TechCrunch bubble, if you like, you know, looking at the same kinds of startups. You know, you kind of look at you know, Y Combinator demo day, and you kind of see the same kinds of companies that we saw 5 years ago. And then in contrast to that, I'm looking at this other world of people trying to solve huge problems with unbelievable know-how and knowledge, which they have gathered just from a resolute, you know, obsessive pursuit of it inside a lab. And I just thought, wow, you know, we've got to really, like, to bring these worlds together is where there can be just an explosion of innovation in terms of the next wave. And of course, when we look around everything that's happening, you know, we're seeing, the biggest companies in the world kind of become more deep tech companies. You know, they're inventing autonomous vehicles and quantum computers now, not search engines and
right,
iPhone
and photo apps and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of like, so we must kind of bring these worlds together because we've got big problems to solve in the world, but it's also where the venture opportunity is going to come from and the innovation opportunity is going to come from. So I was, you know, when I finished Pollenizer, I think I was just incredibly lucky because it was around that time that Bill Barty, who's one of the sort of great VCs here in Australia, sort of told me that he was employee number one, and he'd been hired by the CSIRO to actually start a new venture capital fund called Made Sequence Ventures, or would I like to come along and join him on the journey? So it was just immaculate timing, and that was exactly what I wanted to do. You know, I really feel like it's my next mission for the next 10 years to make some great companies out of this research, and that's what Main Sequence is all about. It's currently a $100 million venture fund. The first two LPs are the federal government with 70 million, and a further 30 million from the CSIRO directly, which comes from CSIRO's royalties from Wi-Fi, which it invented.
Can you explain to people that may not be clear exactly what CSIRO is?
Sorry, so the CSIRO is the Commonwealth Scientific and Industry Research Organisation. So it's basically the Australian federal government's research agency.
Got it.
And it's been going for about 100 years, and it's the most amazing organisation because it was founded to solve national problems using science. So it actually was founded around agriculture and a whole bunch of amazing technologies around agriculture came out of the CSIRO that enable us to have food at the scale that we all eat today. But now there's a whole bunch of different groups inside the CSIRO working on extraordinary things from manufacturing, land and water, data, energy, ag and food, and there's literally some of the best researchers in the world. 5,500 people all PhDs, postdocs, absolutely brilliant people working on hard problems. And, you know, that's our home now. But our fund is for more than that group. That group is kind of, you know, it's part of our capability as a fund, but we're for the entire entrepreneurship and research community across Australia and to make global companies.
Yeah, I mean, this is a gigantic opportunity. And I think if you go back, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, right? But I think if you go back and look at what you did and what you've accomplished, but also what you said about yourself, you know, you like to live in the future.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's so obvious now if you listen to the conversation what that really means, right? So if you go back to Kazaa and think about the idea that you can use the entire network, the entire internet, right? You didn't use the word, but sort of to disintermediate. I mean, you said the guys said that there was a lot of waste out there, right? And it was all getting pushed one way. What Kazaa did and pioneered was this concept of we can have a distributed network and then we can distribute content. You said there were videos of, you know, people at parties, but you could have really done anything and had it distributed before YouTube, right? And all the sort of things that we take for granted today. You guys were involved in building that future. And we could even make the case that, and we don't have to, but I can't get it out of my mind, right? Things like blockchain, so distributed ledgers where the information is shared across a network where there is a complete lack of, not lack, but almost a lack of centralization. It's completely decentralized and middlemen sort of get taken out at every step. You guys were building this back in the Kazaa days, or at least conceptualizing it. And it means to me that if I now look at sort of the end of the learnings of Pollenizer, but putting them to use at main sequence and saying, we're now going to build in deep tech, and whether it's ag tech or any of the other things that you're going to confront and build around, is that is the future. And so it seems to me, and you said it as well, like if all the Y Combinator companies are starting to look similar, there is a fatigue. I will admit that. And I talk about it a lot. There's a fatigue around sort of demo days and pitch competitions because it's all sort of sounds the same. It's blurring into sort of one big business model, which is getting boring. But what you guys are doing is the future again.
Yeah, well, that's right. Otherwise, we wouldn't be comfortable. But it's interesting what you're saying about the sort of the network effect, because you know one of our theses in main sequence is that the underperformance, shall we say, of innovation activity in Australia in particular is driven by the work being too siloed. You know, trying to sort of do everything inside a lab, or in fact, you know, and it's not just the researchers. In fact, I mean, one of my observations is, as a active participant in the ecosystems of Asia Pacific, in itself, they are a silo. They are their own silos.
They are.
In which people get stuck in their own bubble and they're not networking their understanding. So, you know, even though it's not sort of expressed in a digital network yet, shall we say, that in terms of how we're behaving as a fund, it's a belief in the fabric of the whole innovation system and trying to get these different communities together. So if you're in a co-working building, go and spend time in a university and look at what's happening. If you're in a university, get out of your lab and go and watch a pitch night and see what's happening. And we're already having quite a lot of success there in actually bringing some of these worlds together. So as we start to see big companies, startups, innovators, entrepreneurs, scientists, students, all starting to sort of pop their head over the trenches and look to the horizon and actually find some unusual people to start working with and some other sources of inspiration, I think it's going to be very powerful. And that's certainly what we think is necessary for us to be successful as a fund.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any other words except you just continue to find the right way to build the future.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
but it really is like, that's just a phrase that's in my head when I talk to you. And I like the way it just keeps getting more and more, not specific, but just more and more efficient in the mechanism that you're using to do that. I think it's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think we have to do that, don't we? Because, you and I work in an environment that's fraught with risk, but we accept that.
Absolutely.
And therefore part of our job is to design a way of operating which step by step, bit by bit, removes risk along the way. And we know we're never going to do it, never going to fully do it. But it's an important job for us to help the people around us.
Yeah. Look, Phil, I think that is a perfect way to end this conversation. And I'm hoping, because I believe that what you're doing now is like you've always done. Like I said, it's like building the future. And I hope that we can come back in a few months and just catch up again and find out how things are going. Because I think in the same way, you may or may not know this, I'm sure you do, but people wanted to be, in organizations outside of Australia, they wanted to be sort of the Pollenizer of Indonesia and the Pollenizer of Thailand and the Pollenizer of Vietnam. People talked about it. You must know that. And yet, now that, like you said, like now that booster rocket has gone out and it's created, everybody's now in orbit, now people are looking for the next thing to be. And I'm telling you, it feels to me like in 3 or 4 years, people are going to want to be the main sequence of the rest of the region. Yeah. But that's just what it feels like.
Time to go to Mars.
It really is. Anyway, I really want to thank you for your
already
time.
Orbital. Let's
go further away, right? Let's build bigger things. I think it's great.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael. I've really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, Phil, this has been awesome. Thank you.
All right, take care.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.